Something doesn't feel right.
I don't know why I'm wearing a sweater. I mean, it's still pretty warm out. Later tonight, I will be catching a screening of The Nun II. Welcome to Initial Reactions, where I give my preconceptions about a movie and then give my first thoughts about said movie as I'm leaving the theater. Out of all the non-MCU related cinematic universes to come out in the past decade, The Conjuring surprisingly might just be the most successful. The franchise as a whole has grossed over $1 billion, yet the average budget for these movies never breaks past $50 million. James Wan sort of blew up as a director after Insidious, and then followed it up with The Conjuring, as well as Insidious Chapter 2. The Conjuring introduced audiences to Annabelle, and it caused so much fanfare that they gave her a spin-off. A couple years later, they followed it up with The Conjuring 2. This movie would introduce us to Valak, also known as the Nun. And when they announced that they were going to be making a spin-off about this character, my thoughts were, that's who they're making their next movie about? Man, that's going to be terrifying. To make a long story short, it wasn't. I mean, there was an interesting lore behind the character, but it was pretty much just shambling from one jump scare to the next. For a movie that was marketed as the darkest chapter in the Conjuring universe, it was quite tame. Don't get me wrong, there is some disturbing stuff in there, but I expected better from a movie that promises to be the absolute darkest it can be. In hindsight, I should have seen the disappointment coming. I mean, Annabelle spin-off wasn't that great, but by the time The Nun came around, we had The Conjuring 2 and Annabelle Creation. The franchise was 3 for 4, so I was optimistic about its prospects. The script was penned by Gary Doberman, who wrote Annabelle Creation as well as the It movies. Granted, he wrote the script for the first Annabelle movie, but I just chalked it up to growing pains. 5 years later, Gary Doberman has had his directorial debut with Annabelle Comes Home, which he also wrote, and is absent from the writers list for The Nun II, only serving as a producer. He's also the writer and director of an upcoming Salem's Lot adaptation, which currently has been shelved by Warner Brothers for reasons unknown. Replacing him as writers are Akilah Cooper, who penned this year's smash hit Megan, as well as Hellfest and Malignant, and the upcoming Megan sequel. Richard Nang, whose previous writing work includes The Autopsy of Jane Doe, 6 episodes of Fear the Walking Dead, and a movie called Eli. And Ian Goldberg, who was also a writer for Fear the Walking Dead and The Autopsy of Jane Doe, and was also a writer for Krypton. The horror to superhero pipeline is real, people. Filling in the director's chair this time around is Michael Chavez, who must have some serious dirt on the execs at Warner Brothers. Because if you count The Curse of La Llorona as a Conjuring movie, this is his 3rd movie as director for the Conjuring universe. Which technically means he's directed more movies for the Conjuring universe than James Wan. The previous Conjuring movie he directed was The Conjuring 3, otherwise known as The Conjuring: The Devil Made Me Do It. Now, I will give credit where credit is due. Michael Chavez is a director who understands the importance of visual storytelling, as well as creating cinematography that is just beautiful to look at. And I will make a point in saying that the worst thing about his movies are not his direction. My hope is that, going into this movie, he's paired himself with a team of writers who actually know how to write horror, how to create atmosphere and mood, and that jump scares are only a small part of what makes a horror movie memorable. And hey, if there's one thing that the Conjuring franchise can lay a claim to, it's that they make follow-ups that are better than the original. That being said, I'm not entirely confident that this movie will be an upgrade from the last one in the same way Annabelle Creation was from Annabelle. And I think it's because it's coming from a director who hasn't really done anything of note outside of the Conjuring franchise. James Wan, David F. Sandberg, Gary Doberman, for better or worse, they've all had careers outside of the Conjuring universe, whereas Michael Chavez hasn't really done anything. I think this movie will prove once and for all whether Michael Chavez is a talented director who just gets boggled down by bad scripts, or if he's a hack who knows what Warner Brothers wants, knows what the audience wants, and will just do the bare minimum because he knows the movie will make a return on investment in opening weekend, more or less. Keep a rosary close. Let's do this. Well, it certainly carries on that tradition. To be perfectly honest, at this point in the franchise, if you've seen one of these movies, you've seen them all. That isn't necessarily a detriment. If you get what you expect, and what you expect is alright, then more power to you. Scott Derrickson, the director of Doctor Strange, Sinister, and The Black Phone, put it like this. Not every movie needs to reinvent the wheel when it comes to storytelling. It just needs to roll that wheel well. Which is fair enough. If the franchise knows what works and what doesn't, and keeps giving audiences what they expect, why shouldn't they continue? But at the same time, I feel that excuses a lot of laziness within a franchise. Yeah, Fast X isn't going to win any awards for its script, but neither will Mission Impossible, and that one was miles better, no pun intended, than Fast X. Speaking of screenwriters, this was a movie where switching up the writers helped out a bit. Tara Farmiga and Storm Reed were given plenty of material to work with. In fact, I'd go as far to say that the entire Conjuring franchise is held up by the performances of the Farmiga sisters. The scares were cleverly done. In fact, there's a couple that I don't really want to mention because spoilers, but when they happened, I was thinking to myself, oh, okay, that's new. It was also nice to see Anna Popwell back in a big budget, or moderate budget, franchise movie again. She's best known for playing Susan in the Narnia movies, and from what I gathered, the actors who played the four Pevensey children never really had any big careers after that. What kind of ruins the movie for me, though, is it's evident that Warner Brothers is not going to let this franchise go for a long time. Technically a spoiler alert, but it's not really much of a spoiler. It's like a clip from, I think, The Conjuring 3. There's a mid-credits scene where the Warrens get a phone call, and Ed is seen answering the phone. That's it. No big tease after that. I'm probably going to find out online that there was another post-credits scene, but I doubt it. Another problem that this movie has is that, well, this is a problem that oversees the entire franchise, and that it introduces new concepts and ideas that are more interesting than the movie they present. Granted, there is some lore that they introduce that actually gets used in the movie, but by the end, I was thinking, oh great, now I want a movie on that. I feel like that's the trick with these movies. Keep teasing these ideas and then maybe deliver on them. Also, I mentioned that this movie would determine if I thought Michael Chavez was a hack who was just coasting by on the success of the Conjuring movies, or if he's a genuinely talented director who just has had bad writers this far. Honestly, the jury is still out. I feel like what he really needs to do is break away from the mode of the Conjuring universe. All the other directors of the Conjuring universe have done it in some shape or form. If he was to come up with an original idea and present it to Warner Brothers or a New Line, I'm sure they'd give him a sizable budget for it. Or if he wants to follow the good old horror to superhero pipeline, he could always ask James Gunn if he has a DCU project for him. Or he could do a reverse Jordan Peele, John Krasinski and do a comedy. To summarize, The Nun 2 is very much like the recent Fast and Furious movies. If you know what you want from these movies, you're gonna get it in some shape or form. Demon possession, jump scares, a final battle between the forces of good and evil that's a bit bombastic for a supernatural horror movie. I'd only recommend this movie if you've seen all the other Conjuring movies and you're a completionist, or if the upcoming Exorcist and Five Nights at Freddy's movies don't appeal to you. We'll eventually get a Nun 3, especially considering the box office to budget ratios of these movies. And also they need to tie this spin-off trilogy to The Conjuring 2. However, I think the movie that audiences and fans of this franchise will really want is to see a Valak origin story about how the demon came into the world. That segment in the original Nun movie with the Crusaders bursting in and sealing it up with the blood of Christ, that's a pretty metal scene.